Hello and welcome to UNA Forum Presents, this time 62nd San Francisco International Film Festival, which will be held in Palo Alto, San Francisco, in the Bay Area from April the 10th to April the 23rd. We are very happy to have a Bay Area filmmaker, Tom Shepard, in our studio, who is going to tell us a little bit about his new documentary. It's going to be a world premiere at the San Francisco International Film Festival. Is Unsettled, Seeking Asylum in America. Welcome to our studio, Tom, and please tell us a little bit about this really very timely documentary.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so the project is Unsettled. It traces the lives of LGBT refugees and asylum seekers who have fled their countries of origin and who are resettling in the Bay Area of California. And so about 5 years ago, I was doing some volunteer work with Jewish Family and Community Services of the East Bay. They're the first refugee resettlement organization in the country to get money from the State Department to actually resettle LGBTQ refugees. In the Obama years, the number of asylum cases and claims started to go up. Increasingly, LGBT became a category, not an official category, but a form of persecution that was starting to be recognized both by the United Nations and also in our country for folks who are seeking asylum. So it's a longitudinal project. We followed the lives of people 4 years, really, in how they're kind of starting new chapters in their lives, what it was to sort of flee pretty intense persecution and you know, really start again here.
So how did you decide for this 4 people and your subjects of the film? How did you decide to have really them, or you had actually other people in the group?
Yeah, so I initially had reached out to Jewish Family and Community Services at that time and said, you know, I think this is a story that most Americans don't know. Would you be willing to introduce me to some of your clients? And right away they were like, you know, it's a great idea, but no. Most of these folks have experienced trauma, if not torture, and a lot of it at the hands of their own families. So there's a real sensitivity there around folks who are just arriving and kind of how vulnerable they are. But they said, if you'd like to come volunteer for us, we need volunteers. So for about 6 months, I was a volunteer, and I got to know some of the landscape around refugee resettlement, and I started to get to know some of the folks, and I think they could see that I was genuinely interested in doing a long-form project that would take time, that would have, you know, a measure of sensitivity, would connect and engage with folks over time, and so that's how we started.
So you actually start building trust with your subjects, and obviously they see in you a possibility to tell the story.
I think so, you know, and in this country, the refugee resettlement model is largely predicated on families. You know, you'll have a family who flees a war-torn country, and then maybe they'll come to the U.S., to the Bay Area, and immediately they'll be connected with community, with other families, members of the diaspora. So, you know, if you're an Iraqi family and you come, you'll connect immediately with other sort of Iraqis or Iraqi Americans. If you're a gay Iraqi man and you come to the Bay Area, the last people you want to see are other Iraqis, perceived or not. You're concerned that they're going to, you know, there's going to be that same sort of vitriol that you experienced in your country of origin. So what we found is that LGBT refugees tend to be at much higher risk for isolation, and there aren't those immediate sort of cultural, you know, connections that can give people their first sort of toeholds when they get to the country. So then the question is, okay, who's doing that work, and what are the networks that are forming to support these folks?
So did you travel also abroad for some connection there, and how does it work in getting actually a visa or trying to get your cameras in the particular places, particularly in the countries Africa or Middle East? Yeah.
So most of the stories we started filming at the point of arrival, when they arrived here. In the case of Subi, who's a gay man from Syria, he had fled Syria, had gone to Lebanon, couldn't afford to live in Beirut, so then moved to Turkey. And it was in Turkey where he got his refugee status. And that's when I actually met him via Skype through the folks here in the refugee resettlement community. And so we were able to do some filming with him on Skype, and then when he arrived, we started filming him, and then filmed him for 2 or 3 years, like all of them. So we did end up traveling to Lebanon to do some filming related to folks that he'd worked with back there, and we wanted to collect footage on the ground that would sort of tell the story of the circumstances in which, you know, people are dealing with pretty homophobic atrocities in some of those countries. And Lebanon tends to be a very common sort of country of transit. So if you're coming from Syria or Iraq or other places where you're feeling a lot of persecution, either Lebanon or Turkey is where you might go and try and get your refugee status and wait for resettlement. So we thought it was important to go there and capture some footage.
So how about Africa? Did you go to Congo and
Angola. So yeah, we have a story that we're following of 2 women, a couple actually, from Luanda in Angola, and a gender non-conforming gay man from Congo, from the DRC. And actually we didn't travel to those places. And so in order to collect some of the footage for their backstories, we had to go to some archival houses and also through the subjects themselves, try and find, you know, folks who might have home video footage and other kind of documentary materials that we could include in the film. So.
Did you have any help from the UN, or did you have a possibility to meet somebody from the UN Refugee Committee?
So Subi's story, when I think it was 6 months he'd been in the US, and the host he was staying with happened to be connected to the State Department and had a friend who works in the State Department. And at that time, Ambassador Samantha Power was looking to find someone who is a gay or trans refugee from the Middle East who'd had some experience with ISIS, and that's the story of Subi. And so they invited him out, and in fact, he testified before the Security Council as an openly gay person about his lived experience growing up in Syria and his experience with ISIS and experience with family. And it's the first time that an LGBT person had testified live in front of the Security Council, and we were able to go and film that. That all happened, and we were able to meet Ambassador Power and film a meeting between her and Subi. And it was interesting because his story was, that's a pretty unusual thing to get here. You come, you have very few resources, you're just starting a new life, and suddenly you're invited to become kind of the poster kid for refugee rights and gay refugee rights. So it was an unusual story to follow Subi, because he had sort of a meteoric rise in the media and the limelight, and that's kind of part of his story in the film.
So, Tom, and talking about unusual stories to follow, obviously in your films that you worked previously, you did the same thing with Knocking and following an interesting religious group. You can tell us a little bit about that, because we do have clips from 2 of your films, since actually the one that we were just talking, the new one, which is going to be premiered at the San Francisco International Film Festival, is still in the process of working and editing the last minute. So tell us a little bit about Knocking. So this is the one that you created in 2006. Yeah,
so Knocking is a film that we created with PBS. I co-directed with Joel Engardio, about really the experiences of Jehovah's Witnesses. And, you know, that's a religious group that most Americans know of, because they're, you know, they knock on people's doors, they have you know, a fair bit of visibility, but very few Americans know some of their history, and particularly as it relates to the Supreme Court. So the witnesses have been before the Supreme Court a record number of times, I think more than any group except for the government, and really around First Amendment case law. So a lot of the cases in the 40s, whether it's you know, kind of mandatory flag salutes or mandatory Pledge of Allegiance cases, it was the Jehovah's Witnesses who stepped forward and litigated those cases. So the film was about that. And also their experience in the Holocaust. People don't realize, because it's an American religion, in the 30s, there were thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses who were in Nazi Germany, and they had quite an interesting history, because they were denouncing Hitler quite early, and for that got thrown into the camp. So the film sort of details some of that history that folks don't know about.
So let's see the clip from the documentary by Tom Shepard, Knocking.
Now let's switch up. You take the next one.
All right, sounds good.
Jehovah's Witnesses are fundamentalists who have an uncompromising faith. The largest question in our world today is whether people of uncompromising faith are going to destroy the other or embrace the other. Whether people of uncompromising faith are going to see it is imperative to act out with violence toward the other or to act out with decency and dignity toward the other. So the question of our world may not be whether we're going to have fundamentalism or whether fundamentalism is bad, but what type of fundamentalism we're going to have.
America needs a tidal wave of the old-time religion.
The media has always liked to focus on fundamentalists who are either ridiculous
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
or dangerous.
For the children's sake, you might have to bear a gun.
The Bible says that there is a way which seems right, but the end thereof are the ways of death.
I'm certainly afraid of extremists who want to take away my rights or threaten our democracy.
But the Bible's very clear how God loves people and how he feels.
Yet Jehovah's Witnesses practice a different kind of fundamentalism. Their door-to-door message may be annoying, but their uncompromising faith hasn't hurt our freedom. In some surprising ways, it's actually helped define it.
The importance of the Bible and how it can help us with our daily life.
Between 1935 and 1958, the Jehovah's Witnesses were in the Supreme Court a remarkable 45 times. And there are periods during First Amendment history when you see a particular group really carrying the banner of free expression. You could say that they don't fight, you could say that they don't vote, but what they have done is litigate. And in a way, they've contributed more to American democracy and the protection of American ideals than a lot of people have with their votes.
Jehovah's Witnesses stood up for their own religious freedom. Even if their intention was not to help other groups, the impact shifted the court's focus to protecting the unpopular and expanding rights for everyone. The right to speak freely on street corners and door to door, to publish an unconventional message without getting arrested, the right to be a conscientious objector of war, and the right of all patients seeking medical treatment to control what's done to their bodies.
So we just saw the clip from the documentary Knocking, which was produced by Tom Shepard, who is our guest in the studio, and we're talking about San Francisco International Film Festival. His film, Unsettled, Seeking Refuge in America, is going to be world premiere in this film festival. But obviously, in the documentary filmmaking, what we saw from the Knocking, they're timeless. I mean, these films are actually for the use in educational purposes, and of course, the premiere, which is going to be at the film festival, is just the beginning. And then we are going back and looking to this 2006 film, which is really important for what we are speaking and experiencing today. So, Tom, tell us a little bit about the process, what you're doing, because you are teaching also documentary filmmaking, and you established a really interesting group for the young people. Tell us a little bit about that and presenting these films to them and talking with them.
Sure. I mean, I was just thinking, you know, when I was growing up as a teenager in Colorado Springs, I think documentary was seen at that point as sort of educational with a capital E, you know, something that's good for you, like your medicine, very kind of instructional, and it was around, you know, that time, me coming of age, where I feel like the medium began to be much more engaging, and you saw groups being able to use it to begin to tell untold stories, stories of grassroots organizations, community building, all of that sort of thing. And now I find, you know, I teach young people in Colorado every summer that they're really excited by it, you know, because you've got a whole array of subgenres. You've got first-person POV films, you've got essay films, you've got historical docs. So in my mind, it's a pretty fresh genre and a pretty non-threatening way, I think, for people to open up difficult issues and even socially radioactive issues. And that's always been very appealing to me, to sort of delve into those issues, but do it in a way that's not going to alienate or polarize folks, but actually, you know, sort of be an occasion to kind of open minds and open hearts and start conversations. And I feel like we desperately need that right now in our time. So. And
one of your films, obviously, that another issue which is very, very important, that it's always present, that AIDS. And interesting enough, you made a documentary in 2011, The Grove, and it's a place in San Francisco Many people don't know about that, and the moment that what we saw from the film telling us that more people died from AIDS than in all the wars since 1900. It's a fascinating story that how many stories and how many memories were put in the Grove, in this beautiful National AIDS Memorial. And the documentary is about. Tell us an inspiration how and with whom you worked on that important documentary.
Right, so The Grove, I collaborated with Andy Abrahams-Wilson, who's the director of the film, and I was co-producing with him and also ended up editing the film. And it was a really interesting story because this space in San Francisco that had grown out of a really small group of folks who had, you know, endured huge and horrible losses in the 70s and 80s, felt like they needed a place to go to. There were certainly social service agencies that were springing up. There were legal organizations to kind of represent the rights of people who, people with HIV. But a space where people could actually connect around their grieving, because there are sort of few, I think, historical moments where folks are dying in masses like the AIDS epidemic. And so it was interesting for folks to do that and to really look at nature as the kind of underpinning of that, a space where you can renew, where you can work in the land, where you can work with others in community, but have this sense of regrowth, because I think the pain and loss was so deep. And so, as you said, it's kind of a place that's hidden in plain sight. It's in Golden Gate Park, but a lot of people don't know about it. It's sort of in this lovely bowl near the California Academy of Sciences. So, so in the 90s, increasingly, folks who are connected, some of the folks connected to that community were like, you know, we need to banner this. It's a national memorial. And so they held a competition to try and figure out a way to kind of raise the profile of the Grove. And that was sort of the story that we told. There were some folks who wanted to create a kind of artistic monument there. And to some, that was counter to what the Grove and the use of the Grove was really about. So we told that story. Yeah.
Let's see the clips from the documentary, The Grove.
Death was like a great cloud.
Can you imagine what it's like to have all of your friends die?
It was such a blur. It was like the world has ended.
How do we remember a tragedy of this magnitude?
8,000 people a day is the toll that AIDS takes in this world.
I think the counter to that is an expression of life.
What can we do? There was no one central place where all of us could come together.
We have an essential responsibility to designate it a national memorial to the thousands of Americans who have died of AIDS.
The president signed it into law. We had what we wanted.
We didn't want to see lots of reminders of death. So it is a healing space.
How do we tell the story in a way that'll be meaningful for people? And for me, a lovely garden doesn't do it.
The Grove is lacking that disruptive, shocking statement that something awful and horrible happened here.
It is hollow ground. It is sacred ground.
If that design goes in, I'm going to be the first one to throw myself in front of the bulldozer.
We're intentionally being a bit stark in this new landscape.
I don't think people will be any more inclined to go and see some charred poles.
I think there's a rebellion that is awaiting us if we go further with this project.
It doesn't bother me that it's not known by the world.
Millions of people visit the Vietnam Memorial every year. Who's even heard of the National AIDS Memorial Grove?
We just saw the clip from the documentary The Grove, which is the work of Tom Shepard, who is actually our guest in the studio. We're talking about the San Francisco International Film Festival, and he's going to have his new documentary, Unsettled: Seeking Refuge in America, as a premiere at this film festival. So, Tom, talking about films and a collaboration, obviously the first film and the last film, there's not always last film, but it's a collaborative work. And you did a lot of work with the PBS and with the ITVS and the POV. Tell us a little bit about this collaboration and creative process.
Yeah, I think a lot of filmmakers at the sort of genesis of their project will begin to develop the project on their own, just as a function of lack of resources. And fortunately, there are small arts grants and film grants that are available. But in an ideal world, if you can develop the idea to a place that you can then bring it to a funder or co-producer. So in the world of PBS, that's ITVS, the Independent Television Service, as you were referring to, could be another television outlet like HBO, increasingly, as you know, Netflix and Amazon, and now even folks in Silicon Valley are really stepping forward and wanting to sort of get into the sort of entertainment, documentary storytelling space. So it's changing very quickly, but one thing that hasn't changed a huge amount since I've started doing this work in 20 years are the economic models. It's still like pushing a rock up the hill to get these projects made. And I do feel very lucky that in most of the films, we've been able to partner with Independent Television Service to get those films finished and then get them on television. Film festivals are wonderful and they're a great place to celebrate the film, the launch of the film, but getting something on television where 1 million or 2 million people can see it is really going to have the most impact. And I think you talk to most documentary filmmakers, they want to make some change. They want to, raise the profile of an important issue that's not being covered in the mainstream. So to get these films seen on television, I think is really critical.
It's huge, and it's obviously there's a movement in the Bay Area with the documentary filmmakers. You belong to one group which is also bringing all these documentary filmmakers together. That's the New Day. And tell us a little bit about this co-op, you can say, for the filmmakers.
Yeah, New Day Films, which is actually a national organization and kind of distribution cooperative, is almost 50 years old and was started by filmmakers in the 70s who were making films primarily about women's issues and feminism and feeling really frustrated that they'd finish these films and then turn them over to distributors and really make very little money, and started to think, what if we get rid of the middleman and start to connect directly with our audience and start to build relationship with professors, with folks who are using films in their community groups. And so all these decades later now, many, many social issue filmmakers join New Day and have this sort of resource of 100 active filmmakers who are also trying to get their work out there. And also just economically, it makes a lot of sense to be able to kind of share resources. Who are the sort of women's studies professors that might want my film about women's issues? Who are the LGBT and cultural studies professors who might want to show Unsettled? So it's become a wonderful resource for filmmakers, but also a vehicle to, make some income and get our films out into the world. So.
And the other important venue, that's the connection with the nonprofit organizations, and particularly dealing with the subject and the topic of your film. So just to make a circle and to talk in a few minutes also at the end about your new documentary, Unsettled: Seeking Refuge in America. What are the organizations that you ideally would like to connect with after the screening and the premiere of your film?
Yeah, no, that's great. We also partnered, in addition to ITVS, we partnered with John Logan Family Foundation, California Humanities, Horizons Foundation, a lot of sort of organizations that have a kind of vested interest in getting these stories out there. I think my co-producer, Jen Gilliman, and I are really interested in bringing the film out on the road. Obviously, we want to have a big launch in San Francisco, but we see that there's huge value in bringing a film that sort of humanizes refugees and asylum seekers out to cities and towns across the country, where people have certainly heard a lot about refugees or Syrian refugees in the news, but maybe really don't know the nuances of the stories. And so our plan is to engage audiences by creating community screenings, partnering with refugee resettlement organizations like IRC, like Jewish Family and Community Services, others whose work, the work they're doing on the ground, might be illuminated by the film, and get people in to see the film and have panels and have discussions. That's the best thing about film.
Exactly, creating the cultural bridge and to really making this understanding about the different cultures and opening people to have a discussion. And just in a few seconds, social media is definitely part of the outreach campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about the social media that you're using and how people can actually find the film and learn about the film?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of an old school guy and need to sort of push myself into the, contemporary world of social media. I don't love it myself. And it's a really valuable tool to be able to let people know about the film. So we certainly are going to use social media and Facebook and Instagram as a way, and Twitter to some extent, I think, to spread the news about the screenings. I do think that there's something really valuable about face-to-face conversation. And I think that's one of the reasons why film is so powerful and documentary is powerful, is that it's sometimes a placeholder for that. I may not know a gender non-conforming gay refugee from Africa, but I can see this film and feel like I'm having a much more intimate conversation. So I'm sometimes a little wary of social media because it can be sort of easy to kind of sit in my living room and sort of observe. We definitely want to do more. We want the film to catalyze, real conversations as much as possible.
So, Tom, thank you so much for being part of our conversation in the studio, and we're really looking forward to see this film, Unsettled Seeking Refuge in America by Tom Shepard at the 62nd San Francisco International Film Festival. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.